I grew up in a small, weather-beaten house on the outskirts of Boston, America, a house that always smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. My parents, Diane and Robert Walker, weren't cruel in the obvious ways, but they had a habit of looking right through me, as if I were a shadow moving across the floor. When they did notice me, it was to point out something I'd done wrong. My father would sigh when he saw the dishes not perfectly stacked. My mother would mutter that I should be more like other girls. I learned early that silence kept the peace. By the time I was 12, I had taught myself how to cook just enough to survive. Pasta, eggs, toasted bread. I read books from the public library, hiding in a back corner where the sunlight hits the dust motes just right. The librarian, Mrs. Evans, used to slip me novels she said were for the grown-ups. Through those stories, I met people who cared, who noticed, who loved. At home, I had the steady rhythm of my parents' indifference. But there was one person who was never indifferent, my grandfather, Samuel Walker. Grandfather Samuel lived in Cambridge, in a wide white clapboard house with blue shutters and a porch that creaked like an old violin. He'd built it himself decades ago, board by board, back when houses were still made by hand and not machines. He was the kind of man people noticed when he entered a room, tall, silver-haired, with hands that looked like they'd both built ships and written letters. His business in construction and land development had made him more than comfortable. People called him a millionaire. He called himself lucky. He used to say, "Grace, love is better than money, but money helps you stand tall when love walks away." At the time, I didn't understand. I thought he was just teasing me about my hunched shoulders. Later, I would learn exactly what he meant. Every summer, I stayed with him for weeks. He'd sit on the porch, drinking tea from a chipped mug, and tell stories about his travels through Europe, sailing across the Atlantic, standing in London rain, losing his wallet in Paris, and laughing about it afterward. He loved Europe's cathedrals and America's open skies. Two worlds, he'd say, but you'll live in one, Grace. Make it your own. He never talked much about my parents, though sometimes, when he looked at me too long, there was sadness in his eyes. "You remind me of your grandmother," he'd murmur, and that was all. When he passed away, it was February, and the snow outside Cambridge fell softly, the way secrets do. I was 24. My parents didn't even call me. The lawyer did. His voice was formal and low as he said, "Your grandfather's will needs to be read. You should come to my office in Boston." The day of the reading, the air was bitterly cold. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and old files. I sat on one side of the table, my parents on the other. My father's hand tapped impatiently against his knee. My mother smiled, but it was the kind of smile you wear for photographs, not people. When the lawyer began, his words came like stones dropped into water. "Samuel Walker, being of sound mind and body, hereby leaves the entirety of his estate to his granddaughter, Grace Walker." For a heartbeat, I didn't understand. Entirety? The lawyer continued. "One house in Cambridge, another brownstone in New York City, a farm in Vermont, and savings totaling more than $8 million. My breath caught. My mother gasped quietly. My father's hand stopped tapping. The lawyer folded the paper neatly and looked at me with something like pity. "He left a note for you," he said, sliding a single sheet across the table. My hand shook as I opened it. In my grandfather's familiar, bold handwriting were the words, "Stand tall, Grace. Don't let anyone make you small again." I don't remember leaving the office. I remember the sound of my heels on the marble floor, the echo of my father calling my name, the cold air biting my face as I stepped outside. It wasn't joy I felt. It was a strange mix of grief and fear. Money had never meant safety to me. Love had. And I had lost the one man who gave me both. The next morning, my parents arrived at the Cambridge house as if they'd never ignored me a day in their lives. My mother carried a bag of croissants. My father brought coffee. "We thought we'd help you get settled," she said brightly, looking around the hallway with hungry eyes. "It's such a big place for one girl." They praised the molding, the old piano, and the oak floors. Then, over coffee, my father cleared his throat. "Grace, we've been thinking." Managing properties and finances like this is complicated. We could help you. For your sake. I stared into my cup. Grandfather wanted me to handle it, I said quietly. He forced a laugh. You're young. You don't understand taxes, lawyers, or maintenance. Let's be reasonable. I'll hire people, I said. His face changed then. The warmth vanished. Don't be foolish, he snapped. This is family money. Grandfather left it to me, I said again. That was the end of that conversation. They left soon after, the croissants untouched, the smiles gone. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from their attorney. They were suing me. The words blurred as I read them. Undue influence. Mental incapacity. Fraud. They were accusing me of manipulating my grandfather in his final days. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the letter until the evening light turned gold, then gray. I hired my own lawyer, a calm, patient man named David Lane, who spoke like someone who'd seen too many families tear each other apart. You have the will, he said. You have witnesses. You'll be fine. But I didn't feel fine. I felt betrayed. My parents hadn't just ignored me. They now wanted to erase me. In the quiet nights that followed, I wandered through the Cambridge house. Each room held something of my grandfather, his books, his tools, his scent of cedar and tobacco. The house felt alive, whispering memories. I promised him silently that I wouldn't let anyone take it away. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized myself. The girl who had once hidden in the library corner was gone. In her place stood a woman in a black dress, clutching documents worth millions, but carrying a heart cracked in two. Outside, Boston was cold again. The streets were slick with rain that looked like melted steel. I took a cab downtown. The courthouse loomed tall, its stone pillars streaked with age. My parents were already there when I arrived. My mother avoided my eyes. My father smirked faintly, as if he'd already won. As I waited for the bailiff to call my name, I remembered my grandfather's last words, "Stand tall." And I did. I walked through those courtroom doors, not knowing that the man who would decide my fate, Judge Thomas Hale, already knew exactly who I was. The courthouse in downtown Boston was older than I had imagined, its stone walls streaked with years of rain, and its windows high and narrow, as though built to keep the outside world from hearing the truth spoken within. The morning was gray and heavy with drizzle when I arrived. My lawyer, David Lane, met me at the entrance. He offered a quiet smile and said, "Just tell the truth, Grace. That's all you need to do." His calm voice was an anchor I clung to, though my nerves felt like waves crashing against a cliff. Inside, the air was too still, too polished, as if even dust had been told to behave. My parents were already seated across the aisle with their attorney, Paula Sharp, a tall woman with sleek black hair and an expression like polished steel. She looked at me as though she had already won. My parents didn't look at me at all. My mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap, and my father whispered something that made her lips twitch into a thin, false smile. When the clerk called my name, I stood and walked toward the plaintiff's table. Every step echoed louder than the last. I kept my head high and my hands still, though my palms were slick with sweat. I wore a simple black dress, my one good dress, and shoes that pinched at the sides. My hair was tied back neatly, and I'd chosen no jewelry except the small silver watch my grandfather had given me. I thought of him as I sat down, his voice, his steady way of speaking, his belief that truth always had a longer life than lies. The hearing began with the usual words that felt both meaningless and enormous. All rise for the Honorable Judge Thomas Hale. We stood. The man who entered was older, with gray hair combed neatly and eyes that seemed to read more than the papers in front of him. His black robe brushed the floor as he took his seat, and then he looked down at the files stacked before him. My parents' lawyer was the first to speak. Her voice cut clean through the silence. "Your Honor, we are here to contest the validity of Samuel Walker's will. The plaintiffs allege that the defendant, Grace Walker, exerted undue influence over her late grandfather, convincing him to alter his will while in a state of mental decline." Her words were practiced, smooth, and sharp as a blade. I felt each one like a small wound. David rose slowly beside me. "Your Honor," he began in his calm, unhurried way, "we will show that Mr. Walker was of sound mind and fully aware of his decisions. This case isn't about mental capacity, it's about greed." The word hung in the air like smoke. The judge nodded, but didn't respond. He adjusted his glasses and turned a page. Then his eyes lifted and met mine. For a moment, something strange flickered across his face. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. His gaze lingered longer than it should have. I saw the color drain slightly from his cheeks. "Hold on," he said softly, almost to himself. "Are these cases against you?" The room went still. Even Paula Sharp stopped tapping her pen. My parents exchanged quick, nervous glances. "Yes, Your Honor," David said, puzzled. "My client, Grace Walker, is the named defendant." The judge leaned back in his chair. For a long second, he didn't speak. His expression softened in a way that made my stomach twist. I didn't know whether to be frightened or relieved. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, warmer, quieter. "Miss Walker," he said, "I believe we've met before. You may not remember me." I blinked, confused. My heart beat so hard I thought it might break the silence itself. I don't think I do, Your Honor." He nodded slightly, as though expecting that. "I was a close friend of your grandfather, Samuel Walker. We served together on a charity board years ago. He spoke often of his granddaughter, Grace, the one he said had more backbone than most men he knew." I froze. My mother's head whipped toward me. My father frowned deeply, whispering something furious to their lawyer. Judge Hale continued, "He was proud of you, Miss Walker. Very proud." He paused, then looked down at the old papers again. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "Your grandfather told me, more than once, that he intended to leave you everything. He believed it was the only fair thing to do." My breath caught. My eyes burned. I didn't dare look at my parents. Paula Sharp stood abruptly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, if you have a personal connection to the defendant or her family, we must request a reassignment. This could constitute a conflict of interest." Judge Hale didn't flinch. "You may make that request, but it will be denied. I have no financial or personal stake in the matter. I am, however, a witness to Mr. Walker's sound mind and clear intent. That is a matter of record." Paula hesitated, clearly unprepared for that response. She glanced at my parents, who both looked pale and furious. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes darted toward me, wide with disbelief. David leaned toward me and whispered, "This changes everything." As the proceedings continued, the judge's tone remained firm but kind. When Paula questioned my character, implying I had taken advantage of an elderly man's affection, Judge Hale interrupted her twice, once to remind her to stick to evidence, and once to tell her that Mr. Walker had written his will months before his final illness. Each time he spoke, my parents grew smaller in their seats. Their confidence cracked like old paint. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and walked to the witness stand. My voice trembled at first, but I forced myself to breathe. I told them about the summers in Cambridge, the blue shutters, the creaking porch. I told them about my grandfather's laughter, the way he said I reminded him of my grandmother, and how he'd insisted I learn to be independent. Paula tried to corner me, asking whether I'd ever discussed inheritance with him. "No," I said, truthfully. "He didn't talk about money. He talked about life." There was a long silence after that. Judge Hale leaned forward, studying me with those kind, steady eyes. I saw something like pride there, but also sorrow, as if he understood more than the courtroom would ever know. When I stepped down, I passed my parents. My mother's hand reached for mine briefly, trembling, but I didn't stop. Her touch felt like the ghost of something that had never really been alive. The session ended with the judge ordering a recess for the following week. As everyone stood to leave, I gathered my papers, my legs weak but steady. My father glared at me from across the aisle. My mother looked as though she wanted to cry, but no tears came. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The air was cool, clean, and sharp with a scent of wet stone. David stood beside me, hands in his pockets. "You did well, Grace," he said. "Better than they expected." I looked back at the courthouse, its stone walls glowing pale in the fading light. "He knew my grandfather," I whispered. David nodded. "He knew the truth before you even spoke it." For the first time in months, I felt something ease inside me. The fight wasn't over, but I finally believed I could win. When the court reconvened the following week, the air felt thick, as if the building itself could sense the tension. I hadn't slept much. My mind kept circling back to Judge Thomas Hale, the way he'd recognized me, the quiet shock on his face, and the strange comfort in his voice when he said my grandfather's name. What no one in that courtroom knew, not even my lawyer, was that I already knew Judge Hale's family well. His son, Michael, was the man I loved. I had met Michael 2 years earlier in New York City when I went to inspect the brownstone my grandfather had left me. After a long day with contractors, I ducked into a small bookshop for peace. Michael was there pretending to read poetry. When I caught him smiling at me over the top of a book, he said, "I'm only pretending to understand this." I laughed. We started talking about books, cities, and old houses. His voice had an ease that made me forget how guarded I usually was. We met again the next day, and then again after that. We walked along the Hudson, sharing coffee and stories about our families. When he told me his father was a judge, I didn't think much of it. I never asked his name. I didn't need to, at least not then. Our connection was quiet, private. He never once mentioned money, even after learning I'd inherited my grandfather's estate. He liked me for the way I thought, not for what I owned. I hadn't seen him since the lawsuit began. But when Judge Hale had looked up and recognized me, I realized fate had just tied every part of my life into one knot. When the session began, the judge's tone was calm but firm. "Before we continue," he said, "I must disclose that I knew the late Samuel Walker personally. We served together on several boards. I was also a close friend to him and, by extension, to his granddaughter, the defendant." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My parents' lawyer, Paula Sharp, immediately stood. "Your Honor, given this relationship, we must request a reassignment of the case." Judge Hale didn't flinch. "Miss Sharp, I understand your concern, but my connection to the late Mr. Walker bears no conflict of interest. In fact, I can verify that Mr. Walker was of sound mind when he signed his will, and that his intentions were deliberate and clear." He paused, letting the words settle. He often told me his greatest regret was how his granddaughter had been treated. He wanted to ensure she was cared for and respected. The room went silent. My mother's face turned pale, my father's fists clenched. I sat still, afraid to even breathe. For the next hour, the judge listened to both sides, interrupting whenever Paula's arguments strayed from the evidence. Each time she tried to suggest manipulation or fraud, he corrected her gently but firmly. "The late Mr. Walker's handwriting, his witnesses, and his correspondence all confirm intent," he said. "You'll need more than assumption." Every word felt like a lifeline thrown across the courtroom to me. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the stand with shaking hands, but a steady voice. I told the court about my grandfather, about his blue-shuttered house in Cambridge, his stories of sailing to Europe, the summers we spent fixing the porch. I said how he'd taught me to stand tall, even when no one stood beside me. Paula's cross-examination was sharp. "Did you ever discuss his will with him?" she asked. "No," I said simply. "We discussed life, not money." Judge Hale's gaze lingered on me. For a brief second, his expression softened, and I felt the quiet strength of a man who understood both love and loss. When the testimonies ended, the judge took a long breath. "This court has heard enough," he said. "The evidence shows that Mr. Walker acted of his own will. The inheritance belongs solely to his granddaughter, Grace Walker." The sound of his gavel echoed through the room like thunder. My parents froze. My mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. My father's face was red with anger, his pride crumbling right in front of him. As people began to leave, I stayed in my seat, trembling, Not from fear, but from relief. I had won not just the case, but my freedom from them. When I finally stood, I turned to leave the courtroom, and that's when I saw Michael standing quietly by the door. His eyes met mine, full of warmth and apology. He gave a small nod, as if to say, "It's over. You're safe now." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Everything I'd been fighting for, truth, dignity, my name, had already been spoken for me. That day, I walked out of the courthouse, no longer the forgotten daughter. I was Samuel Walker's granddaughter, and my own person at last. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. I heard the sound of my own heartbeat louder than the judge's gavel. It struck wood, clean and final, like the end of a storm. The judge's words still echo in my mind. The will stands. The estate belongs solely to Grace Walker. I sat there for a moment, unable to move. My parents looked at me from across the aisle, my mother's lips trembling, my father's face hard with disbelief. When the clerk called for the next case, I rose slowly, gathering the papers that had defined the last months of my life. As I walked toward the door, I could feel their eyes on my back. Outside, the marble hallway was bright and cold. My mother caught up first. "Grace," she said, her voice small. "Please. We only wanted for me to give up what's mine?" I finished. My voice was steady, but inside, something was breaking. She opened her mouth again, but my father stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We're still your parents," he said. I looked at him, at both of them, and realized how strange those words sounded coming from their mouths. "Parents protect. They don't destroy." "No," I said quietly. "You stopped being that a long time ago." They both flinched as though I had struck them. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes filled with tears that came too late. "We're sorry," she whispered. Their apology fell flat, like coins dropped on a stone floor. Cold, metallic, worthless. I turned and walked away, leaving them in that hallway with their guilt and their expensive lawyer. I didn't look back. When I got home to the Cambridge house, the first thing I did was throw open the windows. The spring air poured in, carrying the scent of wet grass and the faraway hum of the city. The blue shutters creaked a little when I touched them. I smiled. My grandfather had built them himself, long before I was born. They were still solid, still mine. I painted the front door a new shade of white, bright as morning. It took me 3 coats to get it perfect, and by the end, my arms ached. But it felt good. Honest work, the kind that reminded me I wasn't fragile anymore. Michael came by that evening with a paper bag full of groceries and a loaf of warm bread. He walked through the front door, like he'd been there his whole life. "So," he said, grinning, "does the victorious heiress eat dinner? Or does she float on money now?" I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. We sat on the porch while the sky turned gold. He handed me a flower, a single tulip he'd bought from a corner shop. "I thought about roses," he said, "but tulips felt more you. They stand tall even in cold weather." It was such a simple thing to say, yet I felt tears sting my eyes. "You know," I whispered, "you sound a lot like your father." Michael smiled faintly. He told me what he said in court. He said your grandfather would have been proud. "I hope so," I said softly. We stayed there until the streetlights came on, watching the world grow quiet. The house glowed behind us, warm, alive. My house. My name. My story. Over the next few weeks, life settled into something new. I met with accountants, lawyers, and property managers. I signed papers and transferred deeds, but it all felt distant. Numbers on a page, not the heart of what my grandfather had given me. The true gift wasn't the $8 million or the houses. It was freedom. One afternoon, as I walked through the empty rooms of the Cambridge house, I thought of the little girl I used to be, sitting alone in the library, invisible, unheard. I wanted to find her again, to tell her she mattered, that she wasn't forgotten. So I started something. I took $500,000 and opened the Walker Foundation, a small fund for children who grew up like I did, unseen. It offered after-school programs, books, and scholarships. I made sure the first grant went to a tiny library in Boston, the same one that had given me shelter all those years ago. The farm in Vermont became my retreat, a quiet place where I could breathe and write. The New York brownstone I kept as a small rental, enough income to sustain the foundation. The Cambridge house, though, remained my home. Its walls carried history, strength, and love. One afternoon, I invited Judge Hale and Michael for tea. The judge looked older, more tired than he had in court, but his eyes still held that same kindness. He sat at my grandfather's old table, tracing the grain of the wood with his fingers. "He built this, didn't he?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Every inch." The judge smiled faintly. "He built more than a table, Grace. He built a future for you." After he left, Michael stayed behind. We stood in the kitchen, the late sunlight spilling in through the window. He turned to me and said almost shyly, "Grace, I want to ask you something." I laughed nervously. "If it's about dinner, I'm ordering pizza." He shook his head, smiling. "Not dinner. Forever." It took me a second to understand. "You mean?" "Yes," he said simply. "Not because of who your grandfather was. Not because of money, but because of you. Because you're strong and stubborn, and you laugh with your whole face." My throat tightened. "You're sure you want to marry a woman who once sued her own parents?" He took my hand. "I want to marry the woman who didn't let them win." We were married a year later in a small ceremony in Vermont, under an oak tree that had been growing since before either of our families had names worth remembering. The judge walked me down the aisle himself. Sometimes I still think of my parents. They live somewhere down south now. They've never reached out again. I don't hate them anymore, but I'll never forget how it felt to stand alone against them. People sometimes ask me how I won, how I kept from breaking. I tell them it wasn't luck or money. It was remembering who I was. A girl who learned early that love can disappear, but truth doesn't. A woman who learned that silence isn't weakness. It's patience waiting for its turn to speak. Money gave me choices, yes. But courage gave me peace. And now, every morning, when sunlight hits the white door and dances across the blue shutters, I smile. Because this house, this life, every breath of it is mine.